We're doing the Bible backwards. We did Revelation. Last week we did Jude. Now we're going to do the third epistle of John. It's a very short, there's only 14 verses. And you might say, why is this in here, especially after you hear it? But it's very important. And I've experienced what they're talking about here in 3 John. 2 weeks ago, we talked about pride and humility. Last week, we talked about false teachers. And this goes right along with it. I'm going to tell you what's going on here before we read it. John wrote a series of 3 epistles. And this one is a letter. It's addressed from an individual, John. He was an apostle, the last apostle. And it's written to an individual, and his name is Gaius, G-A-U-I-S. Now, this letter is a personal letter. You don't see this much in Scripture. But this is what the personal letters sounded like back in Jesus' day. It only contains 300 Greek words, and it fit on one piece of papyrus paper. The author is the Apostle John. He calls himself the elder. You look in verse 1. The elder unto the well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. And when he calls himself an elder, that signifies advanced age. Anybody know how old John was when he died? Over 90. What else did he write? Revelation, right? So he was advanced in age, and he had great authority because he spent time with Jesus. That's the only way you can be called an apostle, is to make sure that you've spent time with Jesus. You go downtown and maybe some churches have apostles, somebody preaching. They're not apostles. The only way you can be an apostle is if you spent time with Jesus. And he did. He probably, this was the beginning, the fundamental time of Christianity. Now, what he's going to talk about happens all the time today. But it must have been a problem in his day. He probably composed this letter while he's in Ephesus in the latter part of his life. It's very personal. It's to one person, from one person, as I said before. Verse 1, again I'll read it. Well-beloved Gaius, whom I love in the truth. Behold, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospers. For I rejoiced greatly when the brethren came and testified of the truth that is in thee, even as thou walkest in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children walk in truth. What's the major word that's reported in these verses? Truth. Because that's where the false teachers crept in and started to teach untruth. And that's what we talked about last week in the book of Jude. Gaius was a very common name during this time. Anybody here have the kid's name Gaius? No. Nothing's known about him. Probably he was a member of the church under John's spiritual leadership. John was given leadership over some churches. And when there was problems, it was his job to solve them. And that's what this is. The basic issue, and I want you to understand this, is showing hospitality to false teachers and lack of hospitality to faithful teachers. Now you might say, well, what's hospitality? Well, did they have Holiday Inns and Comfort Inns and all in these days? There was such a thing as itinerant missionaries, itinerant evangelists. They would travel from church to church, and it was the church's and the pastor's responsibility to take care of them. But this wasn't happening. Some of the teachers that John had sent to these churches, they rejected them. They wouldn't even let them preach. They kicked them out. They refused lodging and provision. Now, does that sound right? It happens all the time. I traveled for 20 years as an itinerant evangelist. I could write a book on the number of times, and I've probably told you this, that people didn't even know I was coming. I'd have a packet of information that I'd send to the pastor, and it'd be up in the pulpit, never opened. I wouldn't, many times, have a place to sleep. I would have to sleep on the floor, on an air mattress. Many times, one time I went into a place where the guy's head of the house wasn't home. He worked night shift. And I had to sit in the car until he came home because I didn't want to be in there by myself with his wife. I went into one place and I needed to take a shower. He said, "You can't. Don't ask me why." I many times was not fed, not taken care of, but that's the life of an itinerant evangelist. Now, that's why it's so important today when we have somebody up to speak to us that's going to speak the truth, that we take care of them. David Ring was just here. I put him up in a motel. I fed him. And he wanted to come back today because he had meetings in Philadelphia. And I just didn't, I thought it was too soon. He got a $1,500 love offering. Many of you didn't know that. That's a lot of money. But that's not always the case. I've been in churches where I got nothing. I drive 5-8 hours and get nothing. One time I got a half tank of gas. Is that right? No. Don't ever have somebody into this church that's not going to be taken care of. It's a slap in the face. Now, I know why some people don't do this. Because some of these guys out on the road are in it for the money. Honestly. I booked for people that were singers, and I booked this one guy in Canada. It was, the People's Church covers the whole country of Canada on the radio. And I thought it was a good meeting because it's going to reach a lot of people. He wouldn't go. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because Canada makes you declare how many tapes you sold in Canada last time you were there, and I don't declare them." So he wouldn't go. This same guy used to take his own offerings. He'd stand in the church and he'd say, "I don't want to hear a jingling in a collection plate. I just want a paper rattling." And I'd get hollered at when the pastor would call me back and said, "What in the world did you do?" He demanded a luxury motel, not just something like Holiday Inn. He had to have a luxury hotel. When I rented him a car, he had to have a luxury car. That's why you have to be careful. I've never once preached for a fee. There's two ways to do this, a love offering and a guaranteed fee. There was one guy in North Carolina, big church, and this was a famous singer. And the pastor said, I'll give you a love offering if you come. He said, I'm not coming, because he didn't want to take the chance. But most of the time in this church that he was going to, he made out a whole lot better, taking the love gift that they give him than a guaranteed fee. This happens all the time. I've known guys that went out. I had a guy at our tent meeting years ago, and he was the same way. His suit cost more than I made in a year. He was very that way. I'd never have him back. I've run up to these guys, run into these guys. I called Warren Wiersbe, who used to be head of Back to the Bible, and I asked him if he'd come to our church. He said, how many seats do you have? I said, this was when we had 300 seats. He said, no, I won't come unless you have at least 500. Now, that's why there's a discrepancy today in not taking care of these guys, because they're not in it for the truth. They're in it for what they can make. But basically, if you do call somebody up, please take care of them, because I'm not always going to be here. But you need to make sure their needs are met. Travel expense, hotel, and love offering. And don't put them in a home. There's nothing worse than having somebody call up here and putting them in a home. I got in one home, they put me in with a cat litter box. And I was allergic to cats, so I didn't even know it. My throat closed up. I had to pay for a motel so I could preach the next day. So please, have a little sympathy toward these people, and that's called hospitality in the church today. Now, why did the churches have this happening? Because there was a man in the church named Diotrephes, and he was a domineering figure in the church. He ran the church, and if he didn't like what was going on, he put the people out of the church. For instance, if you guys disagreed with what he was doing, he would throw you out of the church. You think that can't happen? Yes, it can. Let's go on with this, and I'll explain a little bit more as we go. Beloved, verse 5, thou dost faithfully whatsoever thou doest to the brethren and to strangers. Gaius was a good man. He was a man in the church that loved the Lord, loved the truth, and wanted to see the people grow. Which have borne witness of thy charity before the church, whom if they bring forward on their journey after a godly sort, thou shalt do well. That meant if they came to the church and they preached, he would take care of them. We therefore are to receive such that we might be fellow helpers in the truth. You don't understand, but when a guy comes to preach at your church, your love offering helps him to go someplace else next week. Always keep that in mind. I wrote unto the church, but Diotrephes, who loveth to have the preeminence among them, receiveth it not. John wrote to the church, but this big shot didn't even read the letter because it was condemning him. Wherefore, if I come, John says, I remember his deeds which he doeth. Now, what was this guy doing? He was prating against us with malicious words. He was slandering John the apostle. And not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, forbiddeth them that would, and casteth them out of the church. I went to a church, and I gave the story of our little boy, Chuck. I probably told you this before, I'm sorry. A man came up to me after the service. He says, "You're being used of the devil." We had 7 people saved that night. He says, "You're being used of the devil." My boy was killed, but I would never talk about that in front of people. I said, "Don't you understand why I'm here?" And he was the treasurer of the church. What kind of love off me do you think I got? Nothing. He only had 1 ear, too. Not that that matters, but I've been in churches where the preacher said, "I'll never have you back." And I said, "Preacher, why?" This was in California. He said, "Because you preach better than me." I went to Limerick Chapel in Limerick, and we had 17 people saved that night. After the service, I went to find the pastor to thank him for allowing me to come in. I couldn't find him. Finally, I found him, and he wouldn't talk to me. I said, "What's the matter?" I said, "I just wanted to thank you for having me here." He said, "I do all the planting and sowing, and you did all the reaping tonight." And I said, "That matter?" No. No. But that's the attitude in some churches. And that's not uncommon. I've had checks bounce that they gave me, and everybody said, "Everything comes in the love offering will go to Charlie." They never made it right. I mean, I could tell you story after story after story. I didn't realize how bad it was in these days, but it's no different today. No different today. Diotrephes was a hypocrite, a Pharisee, and he ruled the church. "Beloved, follow," in the verse 11, "follow not that which is evil, but which is good. He that doeth good is of God. He that doeth evil hath not seen God." John's saying there that Diotrephes isn't even saved, but he's in charge of the church. Now, in contrast to Gaius, who was a good fellow, Diotrephes was a rascal, but he ruled the church. You couldn't do anything unless I say so. Now, if you look, John said that he wrote another letter, but the church never saw it. Now, if you look, verse 12, Demetrius is the next person. He is a good fellow too. He's part of the church. And John gave him the letter to give to Gaius because he was afraid if he just mailed it, he would never get it. Demetrius had good report of all men and the truth of itself. Yea, and we also bear record that you know our record is true. I have many things to write, but I will not with ink and pen write unto thee. But I trust I shall shortly see thee, and we shall speak face to face. Peace be to you, our friends. Salute thee. Greet the friend by name. He commends Gaius. He commends Demetrius. But Diotrephes is terrible. He's the cause of the problem. Now, let's see. Why do you think this is in the scripture back in these days? I told you why, what happens today. But why was this even in Scripture? Tell me. Anybody have any ideas? Does this still go on today? One person rules the church, and he does whatever he wants. And there's nobody else that can do anything. And that's not right. But there's always a Gaius. And you can be a Gaius. You can be a faithful member of the church. You can be one that gives the truth and makes sure the truth goes forth. That's the main theme of this, truth. And a lot of guys you have in, not here, but in other churches, it's all show. It's all show. It's no truth. So be careful, will you please? Make sure in the future, if you have somebody come in, that they're not like this. All right? Any questions? Tell me, why is this in Scripture? What is the relevance in those days? Did they have problems in the early church? They sure did. And they needed Paul and they needed John in order to straighten them out. This was the beginning of Christianity. And they were off onto the wrong foot. So that's what this is all about. All right? All right. Any other questions or comments? Did you know that's what 3 John was all about? Go ahead.
I think it's also in there as a warning to be careful when you're beginning to see this in the beginning stages. Don't let it get to this point.
Yeah. Nip it in the bud. And it usually happens in small churches. Because in a big church, there's too much competition. And the Diotrephes doesn't want anybody to threaten his position. All right? I'm waiting for the projector to go on. There it goes.